6,142 miles. That is the exact distance from the western coast of Equatorial Guinea to the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. And as of this week, it is no longer just a geographic trivia fact, it is a tactical firing solution. For nearly a century, the Atlantic Ocean has functioned as an impenetrable American lake, a vast protective moat that allowed the United States to project power globally while keeping its homeland insulated from direct naval threats. On April 23, 2026, that era of geographic invulnerability officially ended. Declassified Pentagon satellite imagery has confirmed an unprecedented strategic disaster. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy has completed construction on a heavily fortified, deep-water military base in Bata, Equatorial Guinea. Chinese warships and nuclear submarines are no longer geographically locked behind the first island chain in the Pacific. Xi Jinping has successfully secured a permanent, fully operational beachhead in the Atlantic Ocean, directly exposing the eastern seaboard of the United States to Beijing's strategic missile forces. How did the preeminent superpower of the globe sleepwalk into a reality where its greatest geopolitical adversary successfully parked a naval strike force right on its doorstep? To understand the gravity of this intelligence failure, we must examine the precise timeline and the calculated deception that led to this moment. The origins of this base do not lie in a sudden military invasion, but in a quiet, methodical, economic entrapment orchestrated over a decade through Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Starting in 2014, the Chinese state-owned enterprise China Communications Construction Company began massive dredging and expansion projects at the commercial port of Bata. At the time, Equatorial Guinea, a nation heavily reliant on its 250,000 barrels per day of oil production, was facing an economic downturn. Beijing offered highly predatory infrastructure loans. By 2021, classified intelligence reports, notably highlighted by then, AFRICOM Commander General Stephen Townsend explicitly warned Congress that Beijing was seeking an Atlantic naval facility. Those warnings were largely ignored, buried under the prevailing assumption that China was only focused on the South China Sea. The official narrative maintained by Malabo and Beijing was that Bata was strictly a commercial logistics hub, occasionally supporting multinational anti-piracy operations in the volatile Gulf of Guinea. But Xi Jinping operates with profound strategic patience. He understands that concrete poured for commerce can easily support the weight of munitions. Between 2023 and early 2026, while Washington's attention was rigidly fixed on Eastern Europe and the Middle East, Beijing executed a masterful geopolitical maneuver. They forgave an estimated $1.5 billion in sovereign debt owed by Equatorial Guinea. The undisclosed collateral for this financial relief was exclusive sovereign military control over the Bata port facility. The commercial facade was maintained with precision until the final camouflage netting was removed on April 23rd. Timing is everything in geopolitics. By revealing this fully operational base now, Xi is capitalizing on a moment when American military resources and political bandwidth are stretched to their absolute limits. Looking at the unclassified satellite telemetry from Bata today, the military reality on the ground is staggering in its scope. The imagery reveals a newly dredged deep water basin capable of accommodating vessels with a draft of over 35 feet. This infrastructure is not meant for regional patrol boats. It is explicitly engineered to dock the PLA Navy's 80,000-ton Fujian-class aircraft carriers, complete with the heavy-duty electrical grids required to service their electromagnetic launch systems. Far more alarming are the reinforced subterranean submarine pens extending over 450 feet in length. These structures are tailor-made for China's Type 094 Jin-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. A single Type 094 carries 12 JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The JL-3 has a verified operational range of 6,200 miles. From the coastal shelf of Equatorial Guinea, every major metropolitan, financial, and military center on the American East Coast, from the naval shipyards in Norfolk, Virginia, to the financial district of Manhattan, is now a viable first-strike target with a flight time of less than 24 minutes. Furthermore, the port is equipped with massive fuel bunkers, extensive munition storage facilities, and advanced Type 346B phased array radar systems, providing Beijing with a dense anti-access area denial bubble stretching hundreds of miles into the South Atlantic. The geopolitical implications of this physical infrastructure fundamentally fracture the existing global security architecture. The entire defensive posture of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is predicated on a secure, uncontested Atlantic Ocean. With a permanent Chinese naval presence established in West Africa, the southern flank of NATO is suddenly and severely exposed. European allies, particularly France and the United Kingdom, who maintain historical and strategic interests in West Africa, are now facing a heavily armed competitor in their maritime backyard. Equatorial Guinea's decision to permanently host the PLA Navy signals a dangerous paradigm shift for the global South. It demonstrates to other developing nations that aligning militarily with Beijing is not only possible without triggering an immediate American kinetic response, but it can also erase billions in national debt overnight. Diplomatically, the United Nations and the G7 have issued severe condemnations, but behind closed doors, emergency security councils are scrambling to assess the reality that the Atlantic is now a contested theater. The immediate economic shockwaves of this geopolitical earthquake are already registering across global markets. The Gulf of Guinea is a critical maritime artery, overseeing the transit of billions of dollars in raw materials and energy supplies. Within 48 hours of the Pentagon's announcement, global shipping insurance premiums for the southern Atlantic routes spiked by a massive 14%. Energy markets, highly sensitive to any instability near West African oil fields, reacted with a sharp $3.50 per barrel increase in Brent crude futures. Container freight rates from Europe to South America have surged as shipping conglomerates factor in the potential for Chinese naval harassment or future maritime exclusion zones. If Beijing decides to utilize its new naval assets to aggressively police the waters off West Africa, the disruption to supply chains will cost the global economy tens of billions of dollars annually, forcing an immediate recalibration of global maritime trade routes. Analyzing the trajectory of this crisis, we must map out three highly specific scenarios for the next 18 to 24 months. The best-case scenario holds a 15% probability. In this outcome, the Bata base remains officially classified as a logistical resupply point, and Beijing refrains from deploying strategic nuclear assets to the Atlantic. To force this outcome, the United States and its NATO allies would have to immediately deploy a continuous carrier strike group to the southern Atlantic, creating a formidable deterrence ring that makes Chinese escalation tactically unpalatable. It would take roughly 6 weeks to permanently reposition elements of the U.S. Second Fleet to establish this perimeter. If successful, China limits its presence to Type 054A frigates on rotational deployments, and the immediate threat of a nuclear decapitation strike against the American homeland is mitigated, though the geopolitical sting remains. The worst-case scenario carries a 20% probability and represents a catastrophic failure of deterrence. In this timeline, within the next 90 days, satellite intelligence confirms a Type 094 nuclear submarine docking in Equatorial Guinea, officially altering the global nuclear balance. The United States is instantly forced to respond by forward-deploying anti-submarine warfare assets, including P-8 Poseidon fleets, to air bases in allied African nations, drastically escalating the risk of an accidental kinetic engagement in the Atlantic. The psychological and economic fallout in the United States would be immediate. The threat of a nuclear strike on Washington, D.C. goes from a theoretical textbook scenario to a 15-minute reality. This sudden realization of homeland vulnerability triggers massive domestic panic, leading to an estimated 12 to 15% crash in U.S. financial markets, wiping out trillions in wealth as capital flees the supposedly vulnerable East Coast financial hubs. The most likely scenario, holding a dominant 65% probability, relies on Xi Jinping's proven methodology of the boiling frog. China will not immediately deploy a nuclear submarine to avoid triggering a Cuban Missile Crisis-style standoff. Instead, they will slowly and methodically normalize their military presence. First, they will dock a Type 052D guided missile destroyer for a goodwill visit. 3 months later, a Type 075 amphibious assault ship will arrive for joint exercises. Within 18 months, a permanent, heavily armed surface flotilla will be patrolling the Atlantic. This forces the United States into a devastating strategic dilemma: the permanent division of the U.S. Navy. Washington will have no choice but to strip critical naval assets from the Indo-Pacific, ships that are desperately needed to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and reassign them to permanently patrol the Atlantic. This achieves Beijing's primary strategic objective without firing a single shot. For the American public, this development is not an abstract foreign policy issue. It is a direct, tangible threat that fundamentally alters the security and economic reality of the United States. For the entirety of modern history, Americans have operated under the assumption of absolute homeland security. The vast oceans were our ultimate defense. The Bata base shatters that reality. The U.S. military must now execute a radical, multi-billion-dollar alteration of its domestic defense posture. The East Coast is completely naked to short-warning ballistic missile attacks. The Missile Defense Agency will require an immediate emergency appropriation to construct land-based Aegis Ashore missile defense systems from Florida to Maine. At a cost of roughly $1.5 billion per installation, we are looking at a minimum initial investment of $6 to $9 billion just to establish a baseline defensive screen for cities like New York and Washington. The economic consequences of this new defense posture will rapidly ripple through the American middle class. As the Pentagon is forced to request an estimated $80 to $100 billion in new naval shipbuilding funds to construct a genuine simultaneous two-ocean fleet, that capital will have to be extracted from the domestic economy. This will manifest as either increased federal taxation or a massive expansion of the national deficit, inevitably driving inflation higher. Furthermore, as maritime security costs rise in the Atlantic, Americans will see elevated prices at the gas pump and increased costs for imported goods as shipping companies pass their new insurance premiums down the supply chain. In the coming weeks, Americans should expect to see a highly visible increased military presence along the eastern seaboard. Naval Station Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world, is now theoretically within the targeting envelope of Chinese cruise missiles operating from the Atlantic. You will likely see more frequent emergency broadcast system tests, a revitalization of civil defense protocols, and a fundamental shift in how local and federal governments approach the physical security of East Coast infrastructure. Yet, if you consume mainstream media coverage of this event, you're likely receiving a severely sanitized, legally cautious narrative. The media is currently obsessing over African debt diplomacy and the environmental impact of deep-water dredging in the Gulf of Guinea. What the mainstream networks are completely failing to articulate is the grand strategic trap that Xi Jinping has just successfully sprung. This base in Equatorial Guinea is not actually about Africa, and it is certainly not about counter-piracy. It is entirely, 100% about the island of Taiwan. By establishing a credible, lethal military threat in the Atlantic Ocean, Beijing is applying paralyzing pressure to the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. In the event of a kinetic crisis in the Taiwan Strait, the standard American operational plan involves surging Atlantic naval assets, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and logistics ships, through the Panama Canal or across the Indian Ocean to reinforce the Pacific Fleet. Xi Jinping has just placed a heavily armed, nuclear-capable roadblock directly in the rear of the American homeland. If the United States Navy has to constantly monitor and defend the East Coast from Chinese nuclear submarines operating out of Bata, those American ships cannot be deployed to the South China Sea. This is the essence of China's active defense military doctrine: fighting the enemy outside of your own territory by tying up their resources globally. It is a geopolitical checkmate move executed patiently over a decade. Furthermore, the media is ignoring the intelligence-gathering capabilities of this new facility. The radar and telemetry arrays currently being calibrated in Bata will synchronize with Chinese low-Earth orbit satellites, providing the PLA with real-time, high-fidelity tracking data on every single American warship leaving the East Coast, as well as line-of-sight monitoring of crucial American space launches from Cape Canaveral, which sits a mere 5,500 miles away. The completion of the Chinese naval base in Equatorial Guinea on April 23, 2026, marks the definitive end of American maritime supremacy in the Atlantic Ocean. The rules of the global geopolitical chessboard have been violently rewritten. not through open warfare, but through calculated, patient infrastructure development and strategic deception. The most important takeaway from this geopolitical earthquake is this. The United States is now actively targeted from both the Pacific and the Atlantic simultaneously, fundamentally breaking the strategic model that has kept the American homeland safe since the end of the Second World War. As we move forward, the critical short-term indicator to watch over the next 30 days is the specific composition of the vessels the PLA Navy dispatches to this new facility. If we see a Type 055 stealth-guided missile cruiser break off from the Indian Ocean, round the Cape of Good Hope, and enter the Atlantic, we will know with absolute certainty that Beijing is actively transitioning from a regional power to a global maritime enforcer. The distance from the African coast to the American homeland has never been shorter, and the illusion of oceanic isolation is gone forever.